Okay, so we're carrying on from page 38 of the Christmas Carol Stave 4, and this is the second thing that the Ghost of Christmas Future shows to Scrooge. So our second vignette, remember, or our second sort of scene or snapshot. Speakers and listeners strolled away and mixed with other groups. Scrooge knew the men and looked towards the spirit for an explanation. The phantom glided on into a street, its finger pointing to two persons meeting. Scrooge listened again, thinking that the explanation might lie here. He knew these men also, perfectly. They were men of business, very wealthy and of great importance. He had made a point of always standing well in their esteem, in a business point of view, that is, strictly in a business point of view. "How are you?" said one. "How are you?" returned the other. "Well," said the first, "Old Scratch has got his own at last, eh?" "So I am told," returned the second. "Cold, isn't it?" "Seasonable for Christmas time. You're not a skater, I suppose?" "No, something else to think of. Good morning." Not another word. That was their meeting, their conversation and their parting. Scrooge was at first inclined to be surprised that the spirit should attach importance to conversations apparently so trivial, but feeling assured that there must be some hidden purpose, he set himself to consider what it was likely to be. So, firstly, he looks towards the spirit for an explanation, and this here shows that Scrooge has to work it out for himself. That says Scrooge has to work it out for himself. And he's got to come to this kind of self-realization. He can't keep looking towards the spirit to tell him what to do. And when he meets these two businessmen, it's quite interesting. He reinforces the fact that he only knew them in a business point of view, strictly business. So he didn't really have any friendships. He only sort of had associates that he knew through a business sense. And they're obviously reflecting on Scrooge's death. They refer to him as Old Scratch. And then they move straight on to talking about the weather. So here we've got this juxtaposition, remember. Juxtaposition means two things being put next to each other in order to get us to compare them. And it's juxtaposing Scrooge's death with the weather. Now, we talk about the weather all the time, and that shows how insignificant he is, how unimportant his death is. That is just a topic of conversation, just like the weather. Now, what we could also say, if we wanted to put more analysis in here, is that actually these people are certainly more optimistic than Scrooge was. You know, although it's cold, they're not moaning, they're sort of entering into the Christmas spirit. But this one of them is not a skater, like an ice skater. He's got other things to think of. So he's not really entering into the Christmas spirit because he's too consumed with work, is the sort of suggestion there. So let's carry on reading. They could scarcely be supposed to have any bearing on the death of Jacob, his old partner, for that was past, and this ghost's province was future, so area, like that's what province means. Nor could he think of anyone immediately connected with himself to whom he could apply them, but nothing doubting that to whomsoever they applied, they had some latent moral for his own improvement, he resolved to treasure up every word he heard, and everything he saw, and especially to observe the shadow of himself when it appeared. For he had an expectation that the conduct of his future self would give him the clue he missed, and would render the solution of these riddles easy. So we can see here that Scrooge is trying to learn. He's trying to pick out the moral, and moral means a lesson that we need to learn. And then we move on to our third vignette, a very short one, where it says, "He looked about in the very place for his own image, but another man stood in his accustomed corner, and though the clock pointed to his usual time of day for being there, he saw no likeness of himself among the multitudes that poured in through the porch. It gave him little surprise, however, for he knew he had been revolving in his mind a change of life and thought, and hoped he saw his newborn resolutions carried out in this. Quiet and dark beside him stood the phantom with its outstretched hand. When he roused himself from this thoughtful quest, he fancied from the turn of the hand and its situation and its reference to himself, that the unseen eyes were looking at him keenly. It made him shudder and feel very cold." So here we see this idea that Scrooge has a kind of corner of the square, or the kind of wherever they are in the stock exchange, where he normally stands, where he normally hangs out. And it says that another man stood in his accustomed corner. Now, Scrooge interprets this to mean, oh, well, maybe because this is his future, maybe I'm not there anymore because I'm living a different kind of life. And he says that here, he'd been revolving in his mind a change of life, and thought and hoped he saw his newborn resolutions carried out in this. So he's thinking, oh, well, I'm seeing into the future, I know I want to change, the ghost's showing me my future, and that's maybe why I'm not where I am. And actually we know sort of that couldn't be further from the truth. You know, it's kind of a bit of dramatic irony here, where the reader knows something that the audience doesn't. The reader knows something that the character doesn't. So we know that actually he's already dead. His time has run out. And I think really what Dickens is suggesting here is that Scrooge is easily replaced. There's another man standing in his corner that's showing Scrooge's insignificance, but also reminding us that there are many more men like Scrooge. And Scrooge is just symbolic of all of those kind of rich, greedy, selfish capitalists. And remember, they weren't all like that. Lots of them were philanthropic as well, but this is a warning to those people who don't think of others. And then we move on to the main scene that we get in the future. So this is Future 4, and we refer to this scene as Old Joe's shop. And what we're going to see is the level of poverty and the level of depravity. That means moral corruption. So people being, doing things that they really should not be doing. And a lot of that, the poverty and the depravity, lead to this desperation. So what we're getting here is a very contrasting view of London. We've had the scenes from the Stock Exchange with the very rich men, and now we're getting the very poor. So just like we always get in Dickens's descriptions of London, we see the rich, and then we see the poor, and we see the mayor, and then we see the tailor, and we see the things all in the shops, and then we see the ragged men and boys round the brazier and the fire, all those bits in Stave 1. And then that keeps coming back. He always shows us the kind of two sides to society. They left the busy scene and went into an obscure part of the town where Scrooge had never penetrated before, although he recognised its situation and its bad repute, that means reputation. The ways were foul and narrow, the shops and houses wretched, the people half naked, drunken, slipshod, ugly. Alleys and archways, like so many cesspools, disgorged their offences of smell and dirt and life upon the straggling streets, and the whole quarter reeked with crime, with filth and misery. So there literally is no sewerage system here, and this sort of, when he's talking about things disgorging their offences of smell, this is people, like literally tipping their waste products into the street and down these sort of straggling streets and alleys and archways. The people are kind of looking for a way out by drinking, and they're engaging in other things that they shouldn't necessarily be engaging in. The suggestion here with it being half naked is maybe there's sort of prostitution going on and all sorts. But this is a kind of real bad area of town. And we see that reflected in the very negative language that we've got there. Far in this den of infamous resort there was a low-browed, beetling shop below a penthouse roof, where iron, old rags, bottles, bones, and greasy offal were bought. Upon the floor within were piled up heaps of rusty keys, nails, chains, hinges, files, scales, weights, and refuse iron of all kinds. Secrets that few would like to scrutinise were bred and hidden in mountains of unseemly rags, masses of corrupted fat, and sepulchres of bones. So we've got all sorts of things that other people would throw away, rusty keys, corrupted fat, so after someone's cooked something and drained off the fat, bones, rags, all people's leftovers, and these people are trying to make a living out of other people's waste, essentially. And again, that really reinforces this sense of both poverty and desperation. Sitting in among the wares he dealt in by a charcoal stove made of old bricks was a grey-haired rascal, nearly 70 years of age, who had screened himself from the cold air without by a frowsy curtaining of miscellaneous tatters hung upon a line, and smoked his pipe in all the luxury of calm retirement. Scrooge and the Phantom came into the presence of this man just as a woman with a heavy bundle slunk into the shop. She had scarcely entered when another woman, similarly laden, came in too, and she was closely followed by a man in faded black, who was no less startled by the sight of them than they had been upon the recognition of each other. After a short period of blank astonishment, in which the old man with the pipe had joined them, they all three burst into a laugh. "Let the charwoman alone be first," cried she who had entered first. "Let the laundress alone to be second, and let the undertaker's man alone to be third. Look here, old Joe, here's a chance, if we haven't all three met here without meaning it." So the charwoman is a cleaner. The laundress is like a laundrette, someone who does somebody's washing. And then the undertaker, is our funeral person. So the undertaker's man, probably his assistant. So we can gather that this is probably Scrooge's cleaner and sort of Scrooge's washerwoman, and the assistant who helped prepare Scrooge's body, just as as happens when people die. "You couldn't have met in a better place," said old Joe, removing his pipe from his mouth. "Come into the parlour. You were made free of it long ago, and the other two aren't strangers. Stop till I shut this door of the shop. Ah, how it squeaks! There aren't such a rusty bit of metal in the place as its own hinges, I believe, and I'm sure there's no such old bones here as mine. Ha ha! We're all suitable to our calling. We're well matched. Come into the parlour. Come into the parlour." So he's just reinforcing there this fact that he's a kind of, he's got old bones, and that's the sort of thing that he's selling, and the place is all rusty and falling apart. And again, that's what he's selling, sort of rusty bits of metal. Okay, so we're at the top of page 40 now. The parlour was the space behind the screen of rags. The old man raked the fires together with an old stair rod, and having trimmed his smoky lamp, for it was night, with the stem of his pipe, put it in his mouth again. While he did this, the woman who had already spoken threw her bundle on the floor and sat down in a flaunting manner on a stool, crossing her elbows on her knees, and looking with a bold defiance at the other two. "What odds then, what odds, Mrs. Dilber?" said the woman. "Every person has a right to take care of themselves. He always did." "That's true indeed," said the laundress. "No man more so." "Why then, don't stand staring as if you was afraid, woman. Who's the wiser? We're not going to pick holes in each other's coats, I suppose?" "No, indeed," said Mrs. Dilber and the man together. "We should hope not." "Very well then," cried the woman. "That's enough. Who's the worse for the loss of a few things like these? Not a dead man, I suppose?" "No, indeed," said Mrs. Dilber, laughing. "If he wanted to keep him after he was dead, a wicked old screw," pursued the woman, "why, wasn't he natural in his lifetime? If he had been, he'd have had somebody to look after him when he was struck with death, instead of lying gasping out his last there, alone by himself." "It's the truest word that was ever spoke," said Mrs. Dilber. "It's a judgment on him." "I wish it was a little heavier judgment," replied the woman, "and it should have been, you may depend upon it. If I could have laid my hands on anything else. Open that bundle, Joe, and let me know the value of it. Speak out plain. I'm not afraid to be the first, nor afraid for them to see it. We know pretty well that we were helping ourselves before we met here, I believe. It's no sin. Open the bundle, Joe." So she's admitted then she's got this bundle of goods and she's going to sell them to old Joe for him to sell in his shop, so sort of selling things on. And she admits here that they've been helping themselves to Scrooge's belongings now that he's dead. Now, this is a perfect example of an extract that you can talk about this event in the novel without needing to use any quotations, as long as you understand what's happening. The kind of idea, the big idea, that assessment objective 1 criteria in terms of explaining what's going on here and what the significance of it is. So firstly, she says, "Open that bundle, old Joe, and let me know the value of it." And really here she's shown that she only cares about what she can gain from his death. And further up here, she says, "Every person has a right to take care of themselves. He always did." So it's reinforcing Scrooge's selfishness, that he always took care of himself. And really what she's doing is justifying her actions. She knows what she's doing is wrong, but she's saying, well, she just needs to take care of herself because there's nobody else to do it. And they know that they shouldn't have been doing this. So I've written a little note up here that you can copy. And this is really the main idea here. They know what they have done is wrong, the laundress, the charwoman and the undertaker's man, and their behaviour is immoral. That means it's, going against morality. They know it's wrong. But this immoral behaviour is the consequence of Scrooge's actions. It, for us as the reader, is a reminder to the rich of their responsibilities. So what Dickens is saying is, if Scrooge had led by example, if he had guided and helped the poor, if he'd been kinder, then these people would be distressed at his death. They'd be sad, they'd be missing him. But actually, because he never showed them any kindness or care, they are basically repaying the favour and mimicking his behaviour. The fact that it's even been set at night time in the dark suggests this idea of secrecy, and that they know what they are doing is wrong. But the message here is, it's up to those who are more fortunate in society to show and guide those who are less fortunate. Okay, you can pause that there if you need to get any of those notes down. I'm going to move on to the second half. But the gallantry of her friends would not allow of this, and the man in faded black mounting the breech first produced his blunder. It was not extensive. A seal or two, a pencil case, a pair of sleeve buttons, and a brooch of no great value were all. They were severally examined and added up, appraised by old Joe, who chalked the sums he was disposed to give for each upon the wall, and added them up into a total, when he found there was nothing more to come. So this is really showing their desperation here. He's not really stolen a great deal, and the seal is probably what they would use to seal envelopes, like a wax seal, just a few little bits and bobs, and that shows the level of their need, that they will stoop to just taking these little tiny things. We're not talking about them taking actual money. Mrs. Dilber was next. Now you'll remember her name from the film. You actually see her in Scrooge's house. Sheets and towels, a little wearing apparel, 2 old-fashioned silver teaspoons, a pair of sugar tongs, and a few boots. So she's taking things that probably won't be missed. But maybe she's not a criminal per se. I mean, what she's doing is wrong. But she's taking things that won't necessarily be missed because she thinks, oh well, no one's going to know, and he was never generous to me. Her account was staked on the wall in the same manner. I always give too much to ladies, it's a weakness of mine, and that's the way I ruin myself, said old Joe. That's your account. If you asked me for another penny and made it an open question, I'd repent of being so liberal and knock off half a crown. And now undo my bundle, Joe, said the first woman. Joe went down on his knees for the greater convenience of opening it, and having unfastened a great many knots, dragged out a large and heavy roll of some dark stuff. What do you call this? Said Joe. Bed curtains. Now this is really important because we've had this motif, remember, a recurring image of bed curtains come back. So this is a direct way of us knowing, for us as the reader, that this is Scrooge that they're talking about. Now, Scrooge used them to protect himself from the ghost earlier on in Stave 1 and Stave 2. They were kind of round the outside of his bed, and they were sort of a way of protecting himself. Now that he's dead, that's all been removed. These curtains were also a kind of barrier to the outside life. We know that he didn't want to associate with anybody, and he could sort of hide away almost behind these bed curtains. But with death, this barrier and this protection have been removed, and he's kind of exposed now. Everyone is openly talking about what a horrible man he was, and he also has to face up to his true nature. So the bed curtains are kind of symbolic here. Ah, returned the woman, laughing and leaning forward on her crossed arms. Bed curtains. So we're on the top of page 41 now. You don't mean to say you took 'em down, rings and all, with him lying there, said Joe. Yes, I do, replied the woman. Why not? You were born to make your fortune, said Joe, and you'll certainly do it. I certainly shan't hold my hand when I can get anything in it by reaching out for it for the sake of such a man as he was. I promise you, Joe, returned the woman coolly. Don't drop that oil upon the blankets now. His blankets? Who else do you think? Replied the woman. He isn't likely to take cold without 'em, I dare say. I hope he didn't die of anything catching, eh? Said old Joe, stopping in his work and looking up. Don't you be afraid of that, returned the woman. I ain't so fond of his company that I'd loiter about him for such things if he did. Ah, you may look through that shirt till your eyes ache, but you won't find a hole in it, nor a threadbare place. It's the best he had, and a fine one too. They'd have wasted it if it hadn't been for me. What do you call wasting of it? Asked old Joe. Putting it on him to be burying him, to be sure, replied the woman with a laugh. Somebody was fool enough to do it, but I took it off again. If calico ain't good enough for such a purpose, it isn't good enough for anything. It's quite as becoming to the body. He can't look uglier than he did in that one. So she literally took the shirt off his back, and that's what she says there. She takes his blankets, and obviously because he's dead, he's not going to feel the cold. But she says really that, you know, this is her attitude, like because of the man that he was, that's why she's doing it. And she says, when I can get anything in it by reaching out, so she's anything that she can grab in her hand and take from him, she's going to. But she says for the sake of such a man as he was. So she's kind of blaming Scrooge for this level of sin and disrespect. So I've just put a note at the top there so that she is sinful and disrespectful, but she blames Scrooge. And if you want to note that she takes his bed curtains, his blankets, and literally the shirt off his back, then you can do. Okay, so you might want to pause there to make those notes. Okay, then separate this bit off. This is where we see Scrooge's reaction before it goes to another scene. Scrooge listened to this dialogue in horror, as they sat grouped about their spoil in the scanty light afforded by the old man's lamp. He viewed them with a detestation and disgust, which could hardly have been greater, though they had been obscene demons marketing the corpse itself. Ha ha! Laughed the same woman, when old Joe produced a flannel bag with money in it, told out their several gains upon the ground. This is the end of it, you see. He frightened everyone away from him when he was alive, to profit us when he was dead. Ha ha ha! Spirit, said Scrooge, shuddering from head to foot. I see. The case of this unhappy man might be my own. My life tends that way now. Merciful heaven, what is this? So Scrooge here is horrified. He hates what he sees. He says he detests it, and he's disgusted by it. And although he says this case of this unhappy man might be my own, he doesn't realise yet it's him. He's still so blind and ignorant, really, that he hasn't realised it's him. But he is really shocked. He needs to realise that he needs to take responsibility for their behaviour, and it's his moral obligation. He is more fortunate, that says there. He is the more fortunate one in society. So therefore, his reaction is, whilst it's sort of exaggerated, I guess, actually what sort of Dickens is implying is, well, it's your fault, Scrooge, that they are acting in this way. So that reaction from Scrooge is really important. Okay, and then we go to our next vignette in Stave 4. He recoiled in terror, for the scene had changed, and now he almost touched a bed, a bare and curtained bed, on which beneath a ragged sheet there lay a something covered up, which, though it was dumb, announced itself in awful language. The room was very dark, too dark to be observed with any accuracy, though Scrooge glanced round it in obedience to a secret impulse, anxious to know what kind of room it was. A pale light rising in the outer air fell straight upon the bed, and on it, plundered and bereft, unwatched, unwept, uncared for, was the body of this man. Okay, so we can see the curtains have been removed. The bed is a bare and curtained bed because that lady has taken the curtains down. Scrooge can't see very well. It's so dark that he doesn't recognise the room as his own room. And nothing's said here. We've just got a sheet with something covered up. And it's as though it was dumb. So this kind of whatever it is isn't speaking. It announced itself in its awful language. So the kind of scene speaks to Scrooge and tells him that it's a dead man in a bed. Now, it says, plundered and bereft, unwatched, unwept, uncared for was the body of this man. Now, plundered means to have things taken from you, to have things stolen from you. And it might be that this is sort of objects, but it might be that life has been taken from this man. He is bereft. Bereft means lacking, but it also means to be sort of really sad and lonely, to be left bereft after someone has died. So after you've lost out, really, is the idea. And then it says, unwatched, unwept, uncared for. And this list here is kind of emphasising everything that's missing from this man's life. And it's exaggerating this building of different words here, and this repetition of emphasising what's missing. Now, unwatched is suggesting that he's got no company. He's got no one looking over the body or kind of with him in his, before he sort of passes into the next life. No one's weeping over his body, so no one cares for him, no one's showing any emotion, and obviously uncared for. So this kind of no care, no company, no emotion, showing that he's already been forgotten. So here we get this suggestion as well from the words plundered and bereft, that really physical possessions or material gain has no meaning or no value once you're dead. All these things are now missing from him, and he's just left as a body. That is what is left. And this is the kind of stark reminder to Scrooge that, it doesn't matter what you've got, because people will take that from you. What will be left is your body. And if you're anything like this man, which we know is actually Scrooge, what you want at this point in time when you're dead is love and contact and people to care for you. But it's all a bit too late now for Scrooge. Okay, so turning over onto page 42. Oh, sorry, turning back, so we just missed a bit. We hadn't read this bit here. Scrooge glanced towards the phantom. Its steady hand was pointing to the head. The cover was so carelessly adjusted that the slightest raising of it, the motion of a finger upon Scrooge's part, would have disclosed the face. He thought of it, about how easy it would be to do, and longed to do it, but he had no more power to withdraw the veil than to dismiss the spectre at his side. So he wants to see who it is, but he literally physically can't bring himself to do it. And then we have this little bit here from the narrator, almost like he's sort of speaking to someone else. "Oh, cold, cold, rigid, dreadful death, set up thine altar here, and dress it with such terrors as thou hast at thy command, that this is thy dominion." So here we're being told how awful death is. It's the reminder that death is awful, it's cold, and it's rigid, and it's dreadful, and it's full of terror. But then he goes on, "But of the loved, revered, and honoured head, thou canst not turn one hair to thy dread purposes, or make one feature odious." And now revered means respected. So it's saying, but if you were a loved, respected, and honoured head, like if you were a person who had been loved and revered and honoured in life, then you can't make death horrible. You can't turn any feature odious and like horrible, and you can't even turn one hair to be so awful. So it's saying death is really only awful if you've got no one to love and honour and respect you, then it's not so bad. "It is not that the hand is heavy and will fall down when released." So literally once you're dead and you can pick up someone's hand and it'll just drop down. "It is not that the heart and pulse are still." So if you are loved and honoured, it doesn't really matter that there's no life left in your body, but that the hand was open, generous, and true, the heart brave, warm, and tender, and the pulse a man's. So what this is telling us is that actually what's more important is how you are going to be remembered by what you did in life. That your heart was when you were, or your hand was when you were alive, open, that your hand was generous, that your hand was true, and that you were brave and warm and kind, and kind of, were a real man, I guess, when it says the pulse a man's, as opposed to being almost like an animal, like we see Scrooge in the game at Fred's house. So you can just write yourself a little note here, this idea that if you are loved and revered and honoured in life, this will be remembered in your death. There'll be happy memories, not the horror of death. If you were all these things, generous and true and what have you, when you were alive. "Strike, shadow, strike, and see his good deeds springing from the wound to sow the world with life immortal." No voice pronounced these words in Scrooge's ears, and yet he heard them when he looked upon the bed. So this is kind of like a voice that he's heard speaking to him in his head. And the language of that bit is different really to the rest. It's sounds old-fashioned. We would call it archaic. And so the idea here is that it's almost like God speaking to him. In fact, we could go back to the previous page and just note that down. So you know, we can see we've got words like thine, thou. So we can put archaic, archaic language. God speaks directly to Scrooge. Okay, so you can pause the video if you need to get that down. Archaic language, God speaks directly to Scrooge. And we can see that then when we come back to this page, where he said, no voice pronounced these words in Scrooge's ears, and yet he heard them when he looked upon the bed. Okay, so it's almost like God is speaking directly to him. He thought, if this man could be raised up now, what would be his foremost thoughts? Avarice, hard dealing, griping cares, they have brought him to a rich end, truly. So Scrooge is coming to this realization now that, remember, avarice means greed for money and material gain. So he's realizing that this is what this man would have been focusing on. That would have been his foremost thoughts, the most important thing in his mind. And he's saying sarcastically, they have brought him to a rich end, truly, because they haven't brought him to a rich end at all. They haven't brought him to a happy ending. So it's this realization for him that focusing on these things in life do not lead to a happy ending. You can even note here that this is almost sort of sarcasm here, because they haven't brought him to a rich end. And we've got to play on words here, because we've got rich in terms of money, but we've also got this idea of something being fulfilling, being enriched. So we can put enriched. Or a fulfilling life. He lay in the dark empty house with not a man, a woman or child to say that he was kind to me and this or that, and for the memory of one kind word I will be kind to him. A cat was tearing at the door, and there was a sound of gnawing rats beneath the hearthstone. What they wanted in the room of death, and why they were so restless and disturbed, Scrooge did not dare think. And this is interesting, because this is Scrooge's fate, really. He's just going to end up as a meal for a wild animal. This is the consequences of not caring. He's no better off than an animal, is he, here? Because the rats and the cat just want to eat his dead body, because nobody is there to look after him or protect him now that he's dead. He literally has no one but himself. Spirit, he said, this is a fearful place. In leaving it, I shall not leave its lesson. Trust me, let us go. Now, I've picked out lesson there because he has learnt this lesson, but again, we've still got this irony because he hasn't yet learned that it is him. So he thinks he's learnt this lesson, but he's not really facing up to it. I think he knows that it's him, doesn't he? Because Dickens is trying to give us that impression. That's why he can't pull back the blanket. But until he faces up to the fact that it's him that's died, he's not going to be able to make this change. Still the ghost pointed with an unmoved finger to the head. I understand you, Scrooge returned, and I would do if I could, but I have not the power, spirit. I have not the power. So again, this is this idea that he cannot pull back the blanket over the head to see that it's him. Again, it seemed to look upon him. If there is any person in the town who feels emotion caused by this man's death, said Scrooge, quite agonized, show that spirit to me, spirit, I beseech you. So he's now really upset, agonized, and he's begging, beseeching the ghost to show him someone that feels some emotion. He is in total disbelief that no one cares, and it's almost like Dickens is suggesting he needs to know that there is at least one person out that cares for this man before he can bring himself to realise that it's himself. Okay, so we'll stop there with this bit of Stave 4, Old Joe's shop and the dead body in the bed.